As the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas continues, now 258 days after the 7th of October attack by Hamas on Israel, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pulled the plug on his war cabinet. That's a special body formed days after the attack and charged with the responsibility of directing Israel's response. It's yet another destabilising blow to the leader, who is now staring at the prospect of having to call a national election, all while trying to appease influential members of his own coalition. It's a messy, complex situation, and in today's deep dive, we're going to try and break it all down.
So Sam, earlier this week, there was one of the most significant changes to domestic Israeli politics since the beginning of this current war between Israel and Hamas in October. And that was the dissolution of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, which we'll explain what that is in a minute. So that happened on Monday, and then in the days since, the mounting pressure on Netanyahu to resign and call a new election has only grown amongst citizens in Israel. Can you start by just giving us some background on why this war cabinet was established in the first place?
Sure. So this war cabinet was set up in response to the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October. I think it was about 5 days after that attack, so relatively quickly. So just a reminder, on that day, Hamas launched a significant assault on Israel, resulting in roughly 1,200 deaths. That's according to UN data. They also captured about 240 hostages, with around 120 still held in Gaza. Israel responded with a declaration of war on Hamas and a bombardment of Gaza. This military response has led to a severe humanitarian crisis, with over 37,200 Palestinians reported killed since the conflict began. That's again according to UN data. And just to give you a sense of how severe this humanitarian crisis really is, the UN rights chief recently said there has been unconscionable death and suffering. More than 120,000 people in Gaza, overwhelmingly women and children, have been killed or injured since the 7th of October as the result of the intensive Israeli offensives.
So that kind of gives the background of why Israel set up this war cabinet, but can you tell me more about what happens once it is set up?
So the 7th of October attack happens in Israel. 5 days later, Benjamin Netanyahu deemed the circumstances so serious that it required the establishment of this unique body called a war cabinet. The special body was meant to be this small, high-level decision-making group within the Israeli government, purely established to oversee its conduct in the war. And it included senior ministers and officials who were charged with making crucial decisions regarding military activities and strategies. And I think part of the reason why they kept it so small was to make them quickly. And importantly, it included people from major parties across the Israeli parliament, which is called the Knesset. So in an Australian context, almost imagine a smaller committee made up with people from both the Labour Party and the Liberal Party. Now, at this early stage of the war, public support in Israel behind a war cabinet launching a full-scale attack on Gaza was high. So 74% of people, according to one poll, said they do not expect permanent peace in the region. And there was record high levels of sadness and stress, according to this poll, in the general population.
So this war cabinet had politicians from across the Israeli parliament.
Yeah.
Who were the key figures in it, though?
So the war cabinet included obviously the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and Benny Gantz, who is a prominent centrist politician and Benjamin Netanyahu's main political rival, obviously in times where the country is not in war and they need to come together. So Gantz is a former military chief and Defence Minister. The cabinet was set up at the beginning to meet at a minimum once every 48 hours. So that's quite a remarkable cadence for this group to be meeting. There were also 3 observer members who participated in discussions, but they didn't have the power to make or override decisions. So in many ways, they were kind of more there to consult.
So that kind of gives us the context of the last 8 months and how this war cabinet has operated.
Yeah.
But then this week, there have been 2 resignations. So what prompted that?
Well, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, who's a close ally of his, resigned ultimately due to dissatisfaction with Netanyahu's handling of the war. It wasn't a particularly surprising move. Gantz had foreshadowed this exit a couple of weeks ago, essentially presenting Netanyahu with an ultimatum to accept his plan for the war and for Gaza, or he would quit. When Netanyahu didn't meet that deadline, Gantz did indeed do what he said he would do, and he did quit. In a press conference, Gantz criticised the ongoing military strategy in Gaza. He described it as causing a, quote, painful and ongoing price for Israel. Gantz also said, Netanyahu prevents us from moving forward to a real victory. Fateful strategic decisions are met with hesitancy and procrastination due to political considerations.
I was doing some reading before we came in here just to get an understanding of how important Gantz was for the war cabinet. The New York Times described him as one of Netanyahu's most moderate partners and that he helped boost the Israel government's international credibility as well. The article also said that he has also been, quote, one of the most prominent voices pushing for a ceasefire, which we know the international community is really pushing for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, especially in these recent weeks where it's kind of seemed like we're close, but possibly not.
Yeah, well, US President Joe Biden's come out with a clear plan and he's kind of trying to bring everyone to the table to get it in action.
Exactly. And within Israel's war cabinet, this person, Gantz, was one of the key people pushing for Israel to sign it. However, Gantz had ruled out agreeing to establish an independent Palestinian state, so he did agree with Netanyahu in some areas. But protesters fear that the Israeli government's coalition will move even further to the right without Gantz there because, like we said, he was more moderate.
Exactly. And to really get your head around what all of that means and what those implications could be, you have to understand that Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition government has far-right members in it that are also in Benjamin Netanyahu's ear. And so Benny Gantz got up after his resignation and said that Netanyahu must reject what he described as the fanatics within his government. And he warned that failing to do so could lead Israel, quote, to the abyss. So to Israelis, especially those who were already opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu, this really did provide a moment for their opposition to have a strong anchor point to it. And that kind of gave Israeli protesters another opportunity to express their anger towards the current trajectory of the government's war strategy.
I'm interested in that point about Israelis' current views towards Netanyahu, not just the people around the table in the war cabinet, but the entire population. What do we know about how the country feels about PM Netanyahu?
Well, I think it's important to first acknowledge that there's really been growing anger and opposition towards Netanyahu for many years before the 7th of October. This is not a new sentiment. Netanyahu has been under investigation for several years over allegations of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in multiple cases. And these investigations have significantly impacted his political career and also his public perception. Now, opinion polls published in Israel towards the end of last year in the Ma'ariv newspaper shows that 80% of Israelis believe Netanyahu should publicly accept responsibility for the catastrophic security failures on October 7, and his approval numbers as the preferred Prime Minister of Israel have continued to drop sharply since that day. But there's also a more sinister sentiment amongst those who protest against Netanyahu. And that sentiment is that he actually doesn't want to reach a ceasefire because while Israel is in war mode, his own legal troubles are not the focus of the conversation.
Right. I just want to recap exactly where we are. So there's growing opposition to Netanyahu, particularly amongst those who are pushing for him to take a more moderate approach to the war in Gaza. And then his key political opponent, Benny Gantz, who we've spoken about a lot, who he formed this war cabinet with, quit. So what happened after that?
So basically, Netanyahu was left with a smaller war cabinet, and he then decided just to dissolve the body altogether. Now, according to a government spokesperson, there was, quote, no longer a need for the war cabinet after Gantz's resignation. He mentioned that major decisions regarding the war in Gaza would now be made by Israel's main 14-person security cabinet, which has always been there. And that includes a broader group of senior government figures, so the Foreign Affairs Minister, the Justice Minister, and 2 far-right members of Netanyahu's coalition, amongst others.
So that prediction earlier that without Gantz there would be more far-right members within the cabinet has proven right.
Yeah, and whilst the cabinet has changed its name, it really still does have the key responsibility. I do just want to mention that we've talked a lot about the differences between Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, but there was also, as you alluded to, a lot of similarities. Both of them wanted to see the full eradication of Hamas from Gaza, and that's the phrase they kept using. The difference was really in how they went about achieving that mission.
Okay, so there was this war cabinet that has now been dismantled, and then there's the security cabinet, which has always existed, but it's now been empowered to make the war strategy decisions. What is the difference between those two?
Well, I think to really answer that question properly, we need to see what happens and if there's a change of strategy from the IDF in the coming weeks. But I think the really important difference between the two cabinets, besides their name, is that one was positioned to be comprised of members across the political spectrum. And the message to the Israeli people in the establishment of that body was that this was such an important time in their history. It was such a time of existential threat that politicians on all ends of the political spectrum would come together in the name of a unified mission. But now in the Security Cabinet, that's not the case. The Security Cabinet's core decision-making group has 5 members from 3 parties, and all those parties are on the right of politics. And what that means in reality is that Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition, who includes some far-right members, will have more influence over the decision-making process because there is simply a different mix of people around the table. There's less diverse voices. And like you alluded to before, some experts do say that this could lead to a continuation or even an intensification of the current military strategy in Gaza as the more moderate voices in Israeli politics, like Gantz, have exited the scene. Now, it's really hard to imagine what an intensification of the current military strategy would really look like, considering the state of affairs and how much destruction there's been in the past couple of months.
Yeah, I think unimaginable doesn't even begin to describe what a more aggressive strategy from Israel could look like. Now, in the days since, thousands of protesters have gathered across Israel demanding an election. Could we see an election in the coming months?
Yeah, these protests in the last couple of days have been really intense. It also included protesters in Jerusalem actually attending Benjamin Netanyahu's private residence to call for him to resign and to hold an election. Israeli police had to use water cannons to disperse the crowds that gathered near his home, and they arrested at least 9 people. Now, amongst the protesters, this is really interesting, are the families of some of the Israeli hostages, and they say that they're fed up with the lack of leadership and that a deal should have been struck months ago. There are still some supporters of Netanyahu in Israeli society. Recent political polling puts that number at about 10% of the population.
So far from a majority, though.
Yeah, he would probably lose the election if there was one held tomorrow. And that's what 2 major polls, one from a left-wing Israeli newspaper and one from a right-wing Israeli newspaper, showed us. So both of those polls said that Benny Gantz would be the preferred prime minister in a race between the two of them.
Is there any world in which you think that Netanyahu would actually step down?
Look, I think what we do know about Netanyahu is that he's had extreme challenges in the past with various legal cases. He's lost elections before and somehow managed to return. So he's certainly not going to step aside without a fight.
We will keep an eye on the public protests and, of course, on the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus, and we will see you again tomorrow.